When it comes to events that have wounded the world, people usually think of earthquakes, World War One or World War Two, and so many other disasters. But one that rarely gets spoken of is the Trans-Saharan slave trade. The Trans-Saharan slave trade, also known as the Arab slave trade, was a slave trade in which slaves were mainly transported across the Sahara, responsible for the death, mistreatment, and enslavement of over 20 million Africans. The Trans-Saharan slave trade spanned from the 7th century to the 20th century, including the castration of enslaved black men. The Trans-Saharan slave trade is by far one of the oldest forms, if not the oldest forms of slave trade documented in the continent of Africa, perhaps in the world. Egypt was the first point of entry of the Arabs invading Africa. The general Amir Abd Alas invaded Egypt in December 639 with 4,000 men. Despite the Arabs having second thoughts on how they were going to invade Egypt with just 4,000 men, a letter from Muslim Caliph Omar was written to General Amir. And it says, "If you receive this letter, when you have already crossed into Egypt, then you may proceed. Allah will help you, and I will also send reinforcement as may be needed." Hold on, let's go back and understand how this started. The Arabs were already trading with North Africans and West Africans. Despite the Sahara being so large, trade routes still worked and were already established. They traded things like salt, gold, foodstuff, and all those things were carried along and through those trade routes. The Arab merchants conducted business with North African states and West African states. They brought in weapons, fabrics, and other precious and valuable items that could help. But you see, this business was becoming very lucrative, which meant that everyone was winning from each side. But this led to the Arabs wanting more, and they decided to go for cheaper manpower, resulting in the slave trade. Now back to where we were at the beginning. The Arab general crossed into Egypt, received the letter, and proceeded to conquer the country. This was just the beginning of the terror that was about to unfold in the motherland. The Arabs would then go on to conquer western Libya and Byzantium territories of Tunisia. A tradition emerged from early Arab rulers, one particularly being Akbar bin Nafi. He would impose a tribute of 360 slaves on whatever region he controlled. This tradition continued to develop and rapidly expanded into a much larger demand to keep up with the demand of slaves. Some countries that witnessed and endured such brutalities are Mali, Senegal, Chad, and some northern parts of Nigeria and other West African countries. But you see, the north and western parts of Africa weren't the only parts that endured this. The east had an equal share of horrific events that they endured. A Jewish traveler, Benjamin of Tudela, recorded that the Arabs had a unique way of luring and deceiving Africans. In the Western Sudan, the Arabs used to trade wheat, raisins, and some other things, spread them across the ground, and lure Africans, unsuspecting Africans, the ones that wanted to know what they were selling, and purchase. But this method was very rare, and little did they know it was a trap. The spread of Islam in West Africa, especially in areas closer to the Sahara, trade routes, helped with communication between traders of African origin and Arab origin, which fostered and helped more trade. The Trans-Saharan slave trade led to an inhumane forced exodus of over 18 million, or probably 20 million Africans, according to some sources. Exact numbers are unknown. The enslaved Africans went day and day without food or water. Dehydration killed more slaves than the capture did. Taking into account that the journey was about 1,200 miles, meaning this was not an easy journey. There was an introduction of desert camels to reduce the distance, but not for the enslaved, for the slavers. Enslaved Africans suffered and endured cold nights, scorching hot sun, sandy walks, desert animals, insects, reptiles, without any warning. Sick and feeble ones would be left behind to die or sometimes killed, and rebellious ones would automatically be killed. The women captured either became sex slaves or concubines, and the men soldiers, even though they endured way more horrific things than just being a soldier. They were still going to be sold as slaves to the highest bidder once they crossed the desert. Now, entering the horrors that the eastern part of Africa endured, a primary source of enslavement of Africans for the Arab world said that the Africans known as the Zanj were in high demand in general. The slave trade was so big that it was reaching Asia. A first direct evidence of an Indian Ocean slaver was when large numbers of East African enslaved Africans labored on the plantation of the Abbasid Caliphate in Mesopotamia. Enslaved Africans exported by Arab traders were transported to Southwest Asia, India, Indonesia, and China. The Arab slave trade was extremely demonic and lasted for more than 700 years, and probably 700 years before the transatlantic slave trade even began. David Livingstone, a Christian British missionary, stated, "To overdraw its evilness is simply impossible. We passed a slave woman shot or stabbed through the body and lying on the path. Onlookers said that an Arab who had passed earlier that morning had done it in anger at losing the price he had given for her because she was unable to walk any longer. We passed a woman who was tied by the neck to a tree and dead. We came upon a man dead from starvation. The strangest disease I have seen in this country seems really to be brokenheartedness, and it attacks free men who have been captured and made slaves." David Livingstone estimated 80,000 Africans died each year before even reaching the slave market of Zanzibar. There are so many sources that speak on the horrors that occurred during the Arab slave trade, like where pregnant black women would be slaughtered or stomped on by Arab enslavers riding horses, where black male captives would be castrated. Arab enslavers were extremely brutal. They castrated African slaves so that they could not multiply or reproduce, unlike the Atlantic slave trade where they needed more people. The process was so brutal that they went even as far as castrating black males from a very tender age rather than when they are adults. Even the adults got castrated, so they started when they were little, probably less than 10. You see, the Arab slave trade became so big and significant to the Arabs that in 1840, the Sultan of Oman moved his seat of power to Zanzibar in the East African interior, just to make sure that more Africans were enslaved and captured. To understand how long this slave trade lasted for, countries like Yemen and Saudi Arabia abolished, in quotes, the slave trade in 1962. The UAE abolished the slave trade in 1963, Oman abolished the slave trade in 1970, and Mauritania abolished, in quotes, the slave trade in 1981. but it hasn't been criminalized yet. It is still pending, meaning that there are still slaves in Mauritania, and in Libya currently, they are still enslaving black Africans. It was said that the large majority was made up of boys and girls from 7 years to 14 years or 15 years of age, while some of them were women from 22 years of age and their youth from 18 and 19 years. It was said that a woman who was unable to keep up with the march and most likely to hinder it was cut down by an axe of one of the enslavers. Some of the horrors were when some of them had their neck in a large forked stick weighing from 30 to 40 pounds and 5 or 6 feet long, cut with a fork at the end of it, where the branches of a tree spread out. The women had a bark thong. Bark thongs may be soft and subtle, but hours in the sun would make them as hard as iron. Little children were fastened by thongs to their mothers. They went on further and were shown a place where a child lay. It had been recently born, and its mother was unable to carry it. So the slave trader had taken this little infant by its feet and dashed his brain out against one of the trees and thrown it in there. The long journey was accomplished with insufficient food and scarce water, enslaved Africans being deprived of their humanity and losing memory of their homeland. The fatigue, the starvation imposed by their enslavers and by the circumstances which they found themselves gradually ruined their young strength, self-esteem, and sense of self. If enslaved Africans lacked strength to get up and walk again, they are simply abandoned or killed, and their minds slowly fade under the destructive effect of the rays of the sun, hunger and thirst attributing to this. In the Sahara region alone, more than 9 million African captives were imported and 2 million died. During the Arab slave trade, the Tunisian Arab historian Ibn Khaldun from 1332 to 1406 wrote that the only people to accept slavery are the Negroes because of their lower degree of humanity, their place being closer to the animal stage. The castration of black male slaves became a habit among slave traders due to the fact that they were afraid that their wives, concubines, and female slaves would have affairs with them. Castration was done to young boys between the age of 9 and 12, as it was believed that they survived the process more than an adult or adolescent. They made them eunuchs. Eunuchs were considered valuable commodities in the Arab society. They would serve in positions of authority and sometimes trust without posing as a threat to the owners. Remember, they were castrated. They couldn't have any offspring. They were often employed in sensitive positions such as harem. In 1903, there were still 194 African eunuchs in service to the Ottoman ruling family. To control and domination, castration was employed by Arab slavers as a means of exerting control. Enslaved males who were castrated were forcibly removed from their communities. It was said that the black blood flows towards the north. The equator smells corpses. You see, the horrors and the tragedy that was carried out by Arab enslavers and during the Trans-Saharan slave trade, it cannot be said or discussed or described through a YouTube video. There has to be way more facts, way more historical facts and studying and teaching that needs to be done. There were so many unaliving, so many grapes, so many things that happened that cannot be said on a YouTube video. Right now, what we can do best is to bring light and teach the young ones the terror that has happened in our motherland. One more thing to be mentioned was whether or not you converted, enslaved Africans still endured the same punishment and harsher punishments. We can't let the pain, the suffering, the torment, and every single thing that has happened to our ancestors and people that died be in vain. Thank you guys for watching this long, showing support. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notification bell to get updated on my new posts. This is Ancient Final Boss, and we'll meet next time.